Good evening. I'm Julia Bryan-Wilson, professor of modern and contemporary art and director of the Arts Research Center, a cross-disciplinary think tank for the arts here at Berkeley. I'm thrilled to be part of a conversation this evening, which marks and also celebrates the publication of this book. I say this book, and then I was supposed to hold it up, and I forgot. Anyway, there's plenty outside, it's the first comprehensive monograph dedicated to the artist Trevor Paglen, who I will introduce shortly. But I first want to offer some gratitude, first of all, to the Berkeley Art Museum, Pacific Film Archive, the Department of Geography, and the Berkeley Center for New Media for co-sponsoring tonight's dialogue, which is the last event in the Arts Research Center's year-long examination into how arts research takes multiple forms. And Trevor, who has utilized not only photography as a form of research, but has also drawn from amateur astronomers, astrophysics, amateur astronomy, astrophysics, archaeology, journalism, engineering, and artificial intelligence, is the fitting culmination of this thematic. Special thanks, as always, to my associate director, Lauren Pearson, who has been a joy to work with and who is an essential part of the academic and logistical life of the Arts Research Center. And I also want to thank everyone at Phaidon, the publisher of Trevor's book. They were so enormously interesting to work with in terms of the fact that they put a series of authors together to reflect on Trevor, and also I thought were just really easy in terms of the publication process. So I want to give a special mention to the editor there. I have known Trevor for about a decade. In fact, we're celebrating our friendiversary next month, a 10-year friendiversary, during which time I have witnessed his urgent photographic practice expand in concert with his profound commitment to critically engaging with the political realities of contemporary imaging technologies, including surveillance networks, drone warfare, and data collection. Indeed, he is one of the most risk-taking and formally astute contemporary artists working today. Trevor has established himself as at the very forefront of artists and researchers pursuing questions about how photography works, especially how it is pressed into service to work ideologically. His list of exhibitions is astonishing. It includes solo shows at the Vienna Secession, the Broad Art Museum, and Metro Pictures. He has a show currently on view at Altman Siegel in San Francisco. I encourage you to go see that. It's open for a couple more weeks. And he opens a major mid-career retrospective at the Smithsonian American Art Museum this June. His record of laurels and awards is equally staggering, including the Electronic Frontier Foundation's Pioneer Award and most recently a MacArthur Genius Fellowship in 2017. Perhaps most remarkable of all is his deeply ethical stance towards artistic production. Trevor will go to virtually any length in pursuit of his groundbreaking work. For instance, when he decided to take pictures of the hidden internet cables at the bottom of the ocean, he learned how to scuba dive. Trevor, who holds an MFA from the Art Institute of Chicago and a Ph.D. in geography from UC Berkeley, has published 5 books, including Blank Spots on the Map, The Dark Geography of the Pentagon's Secret World, and Torture Taxi on the Trail of the CIA's Rendition Flights. As his wide-ranging oeuvre demonstrates, Trevor is invested in interrogating the policed boundaries between the seen and the unseen. From his Limit telephotography series, in which he uses photographic equipment normally pointed at celestial objects in the night sky to create images of distant military installations, to his collection of mystifying quasi-heraldic patches sported by those working on covert weapons programs, he probes the uses and abuses of visibility. One could say that Trevor has helped reinvent landscape photography for a contemporary era, bringing it squarely and unflinchingly into the domain of contested territories and geopolitical fights for security. Alongside his photography, he has integrated projects with moving image formats and has worked broadly in a range of media, including serving as a cinematographer for Laura Porteous's Academy Award-winning documentary Citizenfour, and creating a durational performance by overlaying machine vision atop the musicians of the Kronos Quartet. Trevor has also produced a series of well-wrought sculpture, including a cube that incorporates trinitite for an exhibition in the exclusion zone of Fukushima, Japan, and a massive non-functional satellite that will be launched into space later this summer. And hopefully we will touch on many, if not all, of those projects in our conversation. Trevor is at once an intellectual force, a major artist with an international reputation, and an activist whose work around state surveillance and governmental secrecy has never been more relevant. Please join me in welcoming Trevor Paglen. So the format tonight is that we're going to have a conversation that should last about an hour, and then we'll take questions, and then Trevor is happy to sign books. This is the lovely book that I was supposed to have to show you in the lobby.
Thank you guys all so much for coming. Like, I'm like freaking out. I'm seeing like so many friends in the audience that I haven't like seen forever, and like so many people I've collaborated with over the years, and I'm just so excited to be here and just love you guys. Thank you.
Well, that leads directly to my first question, which is we have an extremely ambitious agenda here. We have quite a program of kind of chewy intellectual matters that we want to talk about. But here we are, it's your hometown crowd. So I thought you could begin by saying a little bit about how you were formed in this very milieu, and maybe begin with your experiences working at Gilman, the punk club, as a prison abolition activist with critical resistance, working with Ruth Gilmore, touring with a noise band. I mean, this is a really interesting intersection of...
All those people are here.
All those people are here. So what a better way to honor them than to maybe speak a little bit about how your experiences, your extra academic experiences in Berkeley helped shape the artist that you are now.
Yeah, okay. So real briefly, I grew up on military bases. My dad's in the Air Force, and so lived in that context. And that's and I really didn't actually even think of myself as someone who would go to college. Just weird because I didn't know anybody. It wasn't part of what people were doing around me and that sort of thing. And at that time, I had sort of discovered punk rock and like maximum rock and roll and this kind of culture of zines and things like that. And so I was sort of in a position where I was like, okay, I was basically told that I'd apply to college, and the return address on Maximum Rock and Roll said like Berkeley, California. So I was like, okay, well, whatever those guys are doing, I want to go there.
Highly informed.
Yeah,
highly informed.
I don't know how I got in. It was just I just wrote about being in punk rock bands in my admission letter. And when I met people there, like A.C. Thompson, who's right there. I think Dave Ed is back there somewhere, right there. So then started getting involved in that whole scene and getting involved in the punk rock thing, which was really, I guess for me, formative in terms of like understanding the relationship between art and politics. In the sense that when we ran Gilman Street, the thing was like, we don't actually care what your music sounds like. We care what like record label you're on, and we care like what the economics of your...
Because it couldn't be a major label.
Yeah, and we would like do like shifty stuff, like call up promoters and like I remember we had to... Some band wanted to play, and we couldn't figure out if they were on a major label or not, and so we called the secretary, and we're like, well, who does it? So what's the name on your paycheck? And she's like, oh, Sony Records or whatever. We're like, okay, they can't play her, But the point is like thinking about that. We can think of as like a political economy of culture or something like that, but thinking about what are the kind of ethical and economic and social relationships that are producing, like, at that time we would call it a scene, but you could think of it as space, or you can kind of think of it as an apparatus or whatever you want. And so kind of in a way there's kind of a geographical aspect to that, if that makes sense at all.
There's two directions we could go from there. One is to go into talking about then your actual academic degree in geography. Mm-hmm. That's from UC Berkeley. Or we could talk a little bit more, let's linger for a second more on the DIY ethos, because I think it's important to the way that you now pursue collaboration. Mm. So maybe could you say a little bit more about the sense of possibility that a DIY
I think that
space gave
like
you?
Growing up in that scene and doing music and stuff, it was really like you couldn't go and play at clubs that existed and stuff like that, so you just had to completely create your own structure all the time to do it. So when I was in high school, like, you had to have your band, but then you'd have to like create the venue, and you'd have to create the people that could throw the party, and like, so you just have to like build all your own infrastructure from scratch. And I guess for me, growing up that way and being involved in culture that way, like that just came really naturally to me. That like that it's always collaborative to like put a kind of system together.
And
It's
that there's
always
always an underlying critique of capitalism.
yeah, yeah, sure, yeah, yeah,
But not every artist just has that as a default position.
yeah, yeah. No, which I think is very healthy. Actually, it's like, and it gets to a point. Obviously, like these relationships that get much more complicated than when you're in high school. But yeah, I think that like is a good default. I do definitely think I've spent my whole life learning why what I thought when I was 18 was actually correct. I can just say that in more sophisticated ways now.
So, going back to the idea that you were creating your own space, maybe talk a little bit about geography as a part of your intellectual formation, especially here in this department,
Yeah.
working
So
with Ruth Gilmore and all of the people
yeah.
who
So
I know
I'm
were really important to you.
yeah. So there's a lot of different kind of threads, I guess, for me that led to geography. One was I was doing music, and the music I was doing was getting weirder and weirder and weirder to the point where it was just like made out of field recordings and things like that, where it was not, I didn't know what it was. I was trying to think about, well, how do you think about just composing with sound that's not that musicology at that point had nothing to say about. So I started thinking about like landscapes and space, and like maybe that's a language that you can use to think about soundscapes. So that's kind of one thread. I think another thread was that when I was in art school at that time, the kind of whole theoretical language was in to one extent or another really based on literature. In other words, you're thinking about signs and thinking about representation and thinking about culture. You're thinking about artworks in a way that, in order to just make it like a really stupid example, in order to talk about like the Mona Lisa, like as like a formal kind of system of signs or whatever, however you want to analyze it, you almost have to ignore the fact that it's in a place and that it has like a certain value attached to it, and then it has like economies of circulation and reproduction and things like that. And those are things that I felt like the the kind of theoretical tools that I was taught in art school could not account for, you know. And so I wanted to think about like when you're making art, like you know, kind of relearning the lesson of like punk rock was like, no, it's always attached to an economy. It's always attached to spaces. It's always has communities around it and people who are included and excluded, etc. All of these kinds of things that art theory was not good at accounting for. And so I was reading really widely in a lot of different kinds of fields, and came across geography, which is kind of an equally weird field in art in the sense that it's really, really has a huge range. You know what I mean?
Well, I know like Rosalind Deutsch's Evictions was a very seminal book for you in
Yeah,
terms of an art historian who is thinking spatially and
yeah,
is trying to map processes of gentrification and unequal distribution of resources, etc.
yeah. So
Yeah.
that I mean that was a that like an was it definitely like an art book that for me was kind of formative on one hand, and then just more anarchist stuff like critical art ensemble and these kind of things on the other hand. But yeah, Rosalind Deutsch was really using a lot of ideas from geography to think about public space and public art and that kind of thing. And so I guess, and then I was trying to figure out what to do with myself, and I was like, okay, well, you have three options. One, you can go to New York City and like work at 7-Eleven and be an artist. You can go teach adjunct, in Illinois or somewhere or whatever. Or and I was like, maybe you can just like go to grad school, and that's probably pays the same as 7-Eleven, but you're reading books instead of surfing Slurpees, and so maybe we can try that out. um, and then I came across this dude, Alan Pred, who is a professor here at Berkeley, who's just a really beautiful guy, and he at that time was writing, but he was really inspired by Walter Benjamin and just kind of took up that project. He said, okay, fuck it, I'm just going to write books that are images and pieces of poems and text, and half of it's fiction, and just kind of making these really crazy concoctions. And I flew out here to meet him and and showed him some of the stuff that I was working on, and it was almost like, I've been waiting for you. So we just kind of hit it off right away. And basically, the department secretary was like, well, he's down at the end of the hall. There's Alan's office. See you later. And so that's kind of how that started, I guess.
There's a strange Star Wars feeling to the story that you just had. But I want to talk. Let's actually go into some images here. Tell me, click on that. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Okay.
So this is. I mean, you even during grad school, you were starting to think about yourself. Well, because you had gotten an MFA. So I mean, you already had.
I was making art.
Yeah, you were already making art. Yeah, so you were making art. But let's talk about this series. This is a really, important body of work. Where you are training these very high-powered lenses on these very remote military installations, and the result are these intriguingly blurry images. So maybe we can connect this back to this idea of landscape for you, and how landscape has functioned as a critical node in some of your practice over many years.
Yeah. So this was a part of a project where there's a lot of intersecting things. So I was doing a lot of work with like Ruthie Gilmore and Criticals of Resistance, and doing a lot of like prison abolition work, and doing that as an activist, and also looking at that from like an art perspective, and then also in like, academically writing, thinking about that, and thinking about. And then I think like what happened was that when this war on terror started going, I saw a lot of parallels between that and the way that the mass incarceration had happened, in terms of a kind of neo-colonial project, if you will. And, the signature institution of the war on terror being a prison, right? Guantanamo Bay. And then there was, of course, these secret CIA prisons that me and A.C. Thompson spent a lot of time running around looking at. And so then the question I was asking was that, like, in the case of like a CIA black site, the question was, if you're a state, like, how do you make a place disappear? Like, that's a really kind of profound I, question, in a way, and practice. And so when you start looking at the history of disappeared spaces in a way that are that don't exist in terms of official political discourse or legal discourses. You find all these weird things, like in Nevada, at least, like secret Air Force bases and stuff like that, that are really the precedents for that kind of thing. And so I just spent like years, and I still do, just driving around the deserts and trying to photograph these military installations, and you can't get anywhere near them. They're really, really behind huge amounts of like restricted land and stuff like that. So I started using telescopes to photograph these places that like didn't exist. And this image here is shot from like 18 miles away, and so what's happening is that you're looking at through so much heat and so much haze that the image literally is falling apart. Like the colors are all coming detached from each other. The kind of atmosphere is distorting the actual light coming through it itself. And so for me, that seemed like a kind of allegory or something like that. So I guess that there is, but that we could also think about landscape as always being also a performance as well, in terms of the creation of a certain vision of a landscape. Remember, like John Berger, this kind of stuff is being enacting a certain kind of politics. And so the other part of making these images for me was not just about making these images of these places, but a kind of a performance of insisting on one's right to make images of these kind of spaces.
But also, I mean, and the simultaneous legibility and the impossibility of that legibility, that kind of happens, I think, around the blur.
Exactly. Yeah. So for me, that's for me, that, like, in terms of the aesthetics of it, like, that is a very important trope for me, that trope of making a statement and then running away from it at the same time, and sort of trying to have this kind of tension between seeing and not seeing contained in the image. But then there's a political performance that's happening kind of outside of the image, which is the act of making it.
Right. I mean, there's lots to say about what you just said, but one thing to just say is this is an image of Nevada, and that
Yeah.
many of these images, because are in the West, and that is a lot of where your work, this kind of landscape work, takes place, which connects it back to all these many histories, long histories of nationalism and photography and mapping and manifest
Indian
destiny, and
wars and
yes,
exactly.
exactly, and genocide of Native peoples, and how the imbrication of all of these things with photography, with kind of
Exactly.
seeing technologies. So we could talk about that, or we could talk, and let's also talk about that in terms of um, what you just said about performance. I would love to hear you be very concrete about boredom and patience
Mm.
and hardship. I mean, like driving around the desert sounds very uh, that sounds almost romantic,
Mm-hmm.
but I know that this is like tedium, like
Yeah.
hardcore tedium of weight.
No,
And
it's
I
true.
want to, and
Yeah.
I kind of, I'm also really, I think that's something that is important to,
Yeah.
vocalize.
Yeah, sure. So these images are take years to develop, because you're learning the techniques in terms of the equipment that you're using is not designed for photography. There's no manual for this, so it's a lot of hit or miss. It's highly dependent on the atmosphere and the weather, the time of year. You have to do a lot of work to like figure out where you can even go on public lands and try to find sight lines and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of preparatory work that you do, and then as you said, yeah, like for a lot of these images, I'll go and sit on the top of a mountain for like a week in some cases, just looking at the light and trying to understand.
What are you doing during that week?
That's
Like,
a
what
really
do
good
you
question.
do?
I don't know. Like, like, like
I really want to know.
I'm trying. I mean, just like, I carry so much equipment that it's like you not don't bring very much food, so you don't eat much. I think I just bring a book. Yeah, like, yeah, I just read books. Yeah, I'm
You're
reading
reading.
reading books. I
Okay.
mean, and then you have a kind of window in the morning where you can actually be shooting,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, that's yeah. So it is a huge amount of labor
Uh-huh.
actually that goes into these things, and you're right. There is a lot of boredom and tedium, but there is also in those kind of landscapes, there's a you develop a form of seeing that's really different than in a city, in the sense that you become really attuned to like things that are out of place, and it's just a kind of
So, because just to be clear,
yeah.
you're looking at something that you can't see. I mean, you're literally
Yeah,
sitting on a top of,
yeah,
like, if
yeah.
you were sitting on the hood of a car and you're facing a
Not in, no,
direction.
well, and sometimes I'm on the hood of a car. Pretty rarely, usually, I'll have parked a
That
four
was
by
just
four and
my
like
vision of it.
hiked
Okay, yeah,
somewhere.
all right.
So
You've hiked.
yeah,
You're sitting on a rock. There, you know that it's there and you can't see it, but through the lens, you can get a little sense. Only in certain times of day.
yeah,
Only when the atmosphere is right.
yeah.
Yeah.
For the most part,
I mean, I know that people have, certain officious types or some, have said, I can help you make that clearer. If you get
yeah,
the right
right,
lens,
right,
if you do this, and I think it's really critical that you say like, well, yeah, in a way there would be more information in the photo, but it would tell you a lot less.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
These images are always like allegorical for me, and I think photography always. I mean, we don't have to fight about. I mean, we're not gonna fight. We would agree, but I mean, I wouldn't. But yeah, just that's a well beaten horse. At
the one about the
Indexicon,
indexical.
whatever all
Okay.
this photo stuff is. Yeah.
Well, what about the relationship though of these photographs to histories of Western photography?
Yeah, no, I think about them very much being within histories of Western. I mean, Western photography history, as a way I understand it, um, in a particular understanding of it as being linked to uh, like the frontier and colonialism, like and being really an instrument of warfare, and an instrument of surveying. And when you look at the old, Timothy O'Sullivan photos, the cover of the book says, reconnaissance survey of the, this is what they were really what spy satellites were to the late 20th century, like a lot of the Western photographers were to the late 19th century. Look at the Moy Bridge is out, photographing the military maneuvers in Central America and in the West, and obviously then the landscape kind of stuff. Timothy O'Sullivan's out there doing same thing. And so there's a relationship between technology there as well. And so, I mean, we can go in a lot of different directions with that. I mean, so for, I mean, example, the newer projects that I've been doing around machine vision and artificial intelligence are very, they're very much located within. Okay, so I guess let's think about it this way. So this is an image of Shoshone Falls, which photo nerds will immediately know that this is a location of a very famous series of Western landscape photographs from Timothy O'Sullivan. And this is an image of that waterfall as seen through like computer vision algorithms that are used for self-driving cars and guided missiles and a lot of different things. And this image is part of a body of work that I've been working on for many years at this point, which is about the automation of vision. And so it's thinking about images, and it's thinking about the way historically images have always required humans to look at them, right, in order to be sort of like ontologically complete or whatever. But in an image that had never been seen, like that isn't an image, right, because the image is relational in some kind of way.
Right. The image presupposes a spectator or something.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And is that right? You agree?
I don't know. That's interesting. It's an interesting proposition, but keep going, because it is true that now, I mean, the whole point where you're going here is now there's all of these images that are made for and by machines only, that aren't even processable by human eyes.
Yeah. So, for example, if we can take something simple like on the back of a lot of police cars, they have cameras that just take a picture of everybody's license plate, automatically read that license plate, and that information goes into a database somewhere. And so it's a photographic apparatus. It's making images, but it's autonomously interpreting the like meaning of those images and then doing something with it, right? And so, and you as a human could look at those images maybe if you wanted to, but that's not the point. You know what I mean? And so different kinds of computer vision algorithms produce different kinds of abstractions, as it were, or interpretations.
So is this an image of an AI looking at the actual, tell us more about what we're looking at here. Did you take a photograph and then had it? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so this is,
but you went yourself.
Yeah, I went myself. Okay. and took the photograph and then put the photograph in. We actually built the whole programming language in the studio to do this stuff. And then we said, okay, I want to see this photograph of that I made of this waterfall, and I want to see it through the eyes of an algorithm that you would use for detecting edges, detecting relationships between one image and another one, one that would look for objects. And so what you get then here with these lines is like the computer vision algorithm trying to abstract the image into a bunch of lines. Similarly to, if you're in a self-driving car there and you're ingesting probably thousands of images every second, one of the things that you want to be able to do is ingest an image of the road in front of you and abstract that image into 3 lines. Where's the left side of the road, where's the middle of the road, and where's the right side of the road, right? So one computer vision algorithm is like just looking for lines. And so that's be the kind of thing that's going on too, is we can turn that back into an image. And this is another example of that. This is a performance I do with the Kronos Quartet called Sight Machine, and it's a performance where they play, and over the course of the performance, each piece of music that they play is kind of coupled with a different set of machine vision algorithms. So you're watching them, and you're watching them as they're being seen by these computer vision algorithms over the course of the performance.
Right. Yes. This is, I'm a little, I'm thrown by the non-linearity of how we decided to do this. As an art historian, I'm like, then time marches in one direction. We will go 2007, then we will talk about 2008. Okay, so yes.
This is like this year. Like this is.
Ooh, I know, I'm really. So let's talk about 2008.
Okay.
let's talk about the move for you from military buildings, sites in a landscape up back into the heavens, using some of the same equipment, obviously, but now looking at tracking military satellites, etc. Because these things are still very much in dialogue with a lot of art historical traditions. And but I'm curious to hear you talk about the untethering, I guess, of your work from the earthly.
Yeah.
You know,
Um,
when suddenly there's not a horizon line, what happens, and how do these function for you? I guess not only ideologically but aesthetically. We're in it. They're very different. I think they're quite a shift actually
mm,
from the blur. You know,
yeah. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's exactly the same. I mean, so like, I mean, like, no, it's fun, like, to think this way, because, um,
I mean, now
uh,
we're in the monochrome. Now we're in
right? No, totally. I mean, no, I
saturation.
love it.
Now we're
Like,
like a
yeah,
whole
no,
different set of concerns.
yeah, no, yeah. I mean, but or I could tell a different story
Please.
though, which is that me and AC were doing a lot of work where we were, um, trying to figure out where these secret prisons were, and so we were looking at people who were tracking airplanes around, and we were trying to understand how the the what we might call the geography of these CIA programs worked by looking at the movements of airplanes that we knew were attached to those different programs. And over the course of doing that research, I kind of found out, oh, there's this weird group of amateur astronomers who do this, but for like secret satellites. And I thought, well, I'm gonna have to come back to that at some point. And so I did. And basically, what the way that these images are made, they're what you're seeing is these dots, and those dots are stars. This is like constellation Draco, and then you see that line moving through the image, and that is like the movement of a sort of unacknowledged uh, American spy satellite moving through the frame over the course of a long exposure. And so, in terms of, you, for me, it was very natural to go from this view to that, but obviously formally, like, it's a completely different language, and I feel like very promiscuous formally. To I mean, I think it's one of my greatest strengths and one of my greatest weaknesses at the same time.
There's no
Is this,
style. There's no like brand look.
I mean, I don't know. You would have to tell me on that. I mean, like, but you're right. Like, this is a monochrome. Like, this is very a different. There is a kind of real classic formalism to these kinds of things that is different than the blur, I suppose. But
It's
there
a
always that
it's like this.
inscrutability
Yeah, there's an.
there.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think let's talk about this one, which happens to be the very next one
Okay.
chronologically that I happen to want to
Okay.
talk
Oh,
about.
wait. Oh, that
Yes.
one. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I think that one can confuse. Well, what can I say? Something that you are very good at doing is making us feel unsettled or make confronting people with how much we don't know, even through ocularity. So the kind of instability of vision that is, of course, at the center of what you do, and especially around questions of secrecy and the state. But so an image like this, which is very seductive. I mean, this is a very beautiful, extraordinarily finely printed. You have really high production values. Your work. I mean, if there is one thing, it's quite remarkable to me that you come from such a kind of punk beginning, because your stuff is really glossy, it's really fine and polished. So but within this image, there is like a secret almost,
Yeah.
or like it rewards close looking,
Yeah.
you know
Yeah.
so
So that, I mean, that's this slide here. So this is part of a series of images where it's photographs of the sky, and in the images are little drones,
yeah, and
and
this is
and these are like assassination drones,
right, right.
basically. And so these are all shot in Nevada. There's a part of Nevada that's about an hour and a half northwest of Las Vegas. Right next to the Nevada test site is the major drone base where drone missions, wherever they are in the world, are flown from there. And they also fly drones like for testing and stuff there. And so when you drive out there, um, you kind of have to know where this place is, and then you stop and you look at the sky, and you let your eyes adjust, and then you realize there's all these little things that look like insects kind of flying around, and then those are these assassination drones that are being flown there. And so I just started going out there and just photographing the sky, and it kind of became a body of work where you see these images like this, and then if you look really closely, you find these little like insects that are in them, but the insects are these drones. And so these are, I mean, again, like there's this tradition of photographing the sky, and the tradition of like, this is could there's a relation with Stiglitz, and I mean, there's a whole. This is like the kind of thing that like artists have been looking at the sky for thousands and 1000s of years, and I think what one for me anyway, what I try to do is think about that history of people looking at this same landscape in a way, but then how do you see it in a way that speaks to your own moment in history, which is different than somebody else's moment in history.
Well, so what is your relationship then to something like the concept of beauty? I mean, I mean, you're so formally precise. There's all this research, takes years to, there's all the triangulations of amateur mapping, and there's all the scientific work and pretty incredible journalistic legwork that goes into even being able to put yourself in this right space at the right time. But then these really lush images come out of it. And so maybe, obviously that's a tension that you want to interrogate.
Yeah, sure.
We have to talk about that
word.
Our
bet.
Okay, well, I'll come to.
Should we do a parenthetical?
Sure, parenthetical.
No, so we had a bet for it was a lot of money, like $100 or something. Right?
It's like almost no money, like $100. Yeah.
And I was complaining about academics. And no,
it was because it was in my essay.
Oh yeah, well, okay,
it was in my essay. Right, it was like you had no edits. You're like, great essay, great, thanks, check. And I had like really worked on it for it was a really intense assignment for me to try to summarize your what you do. Yeah. It was very hard, I will say. I worked hard on it. And then the feedback was, I just really hate the word interrogate. So take that out. Take out the word interrogate. I was like, I used it once, first of all. And second of all, what's wrong? Like, that's what you do, And you were like, I bet, I know that's such a 9/11 word, or you had some kind of crazy, you had some like, and we made a big, and all, then anyway.
Basically, I was saying like, why are academics like appropriating this language of like the terror state to like talk about their fucking articles and shit?
Yeah. So it all culminated in me doing a ridiculous search in Project Muse.
So we bet, and I said, I bet you're gonna see the frequency of this go up after like as the war on terror goes up, and you're like, no, people have been using this word forever.
Yeah.
And
I won.
You won. and I had to pull out $100 in cash from the gas station on Gilman Street.
Yeah, it's South Pablo. Right. And the word interrogate is still in that essay. That was part of the bet. I got to still use it. Okay, but back to the tension, this structuring tension. I mean, this image is one of, military terror. And it is also seductively, aesthetically pleasing. So please explain how you think about that kind of extreme conjunction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I guess like for me, the provocation is that these things have nothing to do with each other, even as much as we would love to imagine that they do. In other words, like the aesthetics in the sense of like what something looks like, you know what I mean, in relation to what whatever political connotations of the thing that you're looking at represents, right? In other words, if we go out and look at the stars on a clear night, and I show you a spy satellite moving to the sky, and that spy satellite is doing targeting for drones or missiles or something like this, a weapon of war. There's very few things in this world that you will ever see that are more beautiful than that, right? Like literally. And so that's, for me, that's not something to run away from. I mean, I would like to live in a world in which beautiful things were good and ugly things were bad. You know what I mean? But to me, it's I play
yes,
with that
I know
more.
what you mean. I know what you mean, but I think I want to ask you more about the very specific formal choices that you make, and especially images like this, which are I mean, you do a lot of work with your titles. The titles are always really specific. They name the drone, they name the place, they name the, there's always, and with the military installations also, you're really, really precise. And so I know a lot of information is conveyed that way, but I guess it's always been so interestingly risky to me that you go for this sublimity. And of course, the sublime classically is both the terrifying and the beautiful. That's the definition. But that I mean, do you think, I mean, how you don't have a horizon line here? I mean, these are just so interestingly nowhere, you know? And I mean, you could choose to show the Predator drone over a corner store in Nevada that would give you a sense of the emplacement of that, and instead they're kind of nowhere in this hazy field of orange. Yeah, I mean, just speak more to these choices.
Yes, for me, like ultimately by not having it over the corner store or something like that, that conveying that sense of placelessness is, for me, these are images about what does it mean when the sky itself has been turned against you. you know, when the sky has become a weapon. When the sky has become, yeah, I guess that's what I mean. And that is less specific than the corner store. That's less specific than the over the being in Waziristan or the tribal areas of Pakistan or something like that. So there is and again, it is speaking to a formal history as well. Which for me is really, in particular in an image like specifically like this. I mean, it's really playing for me, and what I enjoy doing about it is like that kind of like almost like preposterous abstraction on one hand, and then like the actual opposite of that, like when you look closely and you're like, okay, yeah,
Absolutely. So not abstract.
exactly,
It's so
yeah.
there is like a deathly reality.
Yeah.
Can we talk about the beach? I am shockingly leaping ahead here. Oh no, I'm not. It's exactly the next one. Wow. Okay. So here, now you're kind of back down to earth in a way, and this is a series of images about these landing sites, these internet cables coming on shore. So it's maybe we can talk about how you decide to how you are thinking serially with this project, I guess. How like an image like this isn't necessarily going to just stand on its own.
Yeah, no, not at all.
You wouldn't just show this as like this kind of beach
Well,
image.
I have, but these are okay. So, these are all images that came out of work that I had was initially brought on to do as part of the Snowden project and the Citizenfour film. And basically, what happened was that I was friends with Laura Poitras, the filmmaker that Snowden went to, and she had brought me onto the project, and she basically gave me a pile of documents, and she's like, "Go figure out what this is." And it was all documents describing kind of internet infrastructure and describing how NSA would sit on that internet infrastructure to like conduct mass surveillance. And one of the things that after a lot of work trying to figure out what these things meant, you start to realize that the places where the continents are connected to one another with fiber optic cables are really, really important to how mass surveillance works. So, for example, the US is connected to South America and Europe by really like 5 places on the East Coast, where you have conjunctions of the fiber optic cables that all come together in places on the West Coast again, like 5 places as well. And the idea is that if you're NSA, you want to sit on those places where all these internet cables come together, because you can get it's very efficient, right? And a huge amount of the world's internet traffic goes over them. And so these are, usually these are beaches where this happens because the cables are undersea and they kind of come under the beach and come into a what they call a landing site, which is a building that usually has no windows and has a power supply and connects it to the terrestrial internet backbone. So there's a project where I was going around, and they're all images of these mass surveillance sites, but there's actually no evidence whatsoever of that's in the image. And so it's because these things are underwater and under the beach. And so in a way, this is like even a more extreme abstraction than the drone image that we just saw, even though the aesthetics of it is one of like more of a kind of realism or something like that. But there's no drone. You can spend all day looking at this, and like you will not find the thing that it actually is purported to be of.
But you are, I mean, it's important to you that within the frame of this image, that is where all the internet cables are being jumbled and come together. Right. Yeah. So, and they look, just so people know, this is the images. They're often that kind of beach image is often shown with, and this is the literal infrastructure.
So this is when I started like scuba diving into the photographs that we saw in the last one. Right. So I made these photographs all the beaches, and then I thought, well, let's dive into the
would the word like irony apply here?
Yeah, maybe.
Not I mean, less than abstract. I mean, not abstraction, but.
Yeah, I mean, maybe irony. I guess, like, to me, the word abstraction came to mind in the sense that.
Yeah, say why.
I don't know why that is. I think that because the idea of what the image is completely abstracted from what you actually are looking at in the image, right? In other words, the title of this is NSA tapped fiber optic cable landing site, Mastic Beach, New York, New York. There's zero evidence whatsoever of that in the image itself. Actually, unlike the drones, or even unlike the satellite things, when you look at it,
it's almost the opposite.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
A totally opposite strategy.
It's like the where's Waldo, but then there's no Waldo.
Or here's the Waldo.
There's the Waldo.
Right. I mean, I think one of the things these series do is also just make very concrete the hardware of surveillance networks. I think it's a really important part of what you do is try to really make visible the fact that what we have metaphorized as this diffuse vaporous thing called the cloud is very, very physical and has all these material, threads that actually like underlie a lot of, make everything possible in a way. So maybe this idea of kind of making infrastructure visible could be expanded on in this project, the Autonomy Cube, which is actually on display right now at SF MoMA. So that's yeah.
So do you want me to talk about
this? Yeah, talk about this. I mean, this is,
Should you talk about formally or functionally?
Surprise me.
Surprise. So for me, this is a project. I have a lot of different kind of tricks that I use when I'm trying to think about a project. But one of my tricks is thinking about existing infrastructure, and I always think that there's always politics embedded in infrastructures. And then I try to think, okay, what would the opposite of that look like, right? If we what would like communist infrastructure look like really communist infrastructure, or what would what do the infrastructure looks like that has different politics built in? And so this is a project called Autonomy Cube, which is an ironic title, which a lot of people didn't kind of pick up on, but it basically comes out of the NSA work and the Snowden work, and the question was, what would the internet look like if it were not the greatest tool of mass surveillance in the history of like human civilization, right? And so the question was, could one imagine an internet that is more like a library that has, and the library has two components to it. One, you can get any information you want, but part two, which is equally important, is the police don't get a record of the books that you check out, and the credit agencies don't get a record of the books that you check out. And that part two is really important. And so it's basically a sculpture that creates an open Wi-Fi network for a museum or institution that installs it. But then when you connect to it, it's actually designed in such a way that it encrypts your internet traffic and disguises your location. So it kind of, most open Wi-Fi networks take all your information. Like if you go to SFO and like look at the terms of services, like we're gonna collect everything that you, and like that's the business model. Give you free internet, collect all your crap. So this is the question: was what would the opposite of that be like? Could you design these infrastructures that literally by design could not spy on the people that are using them, which you of course could, but then Facebook doesn't have much of a business model, for it, or Google doesn't, or that kind of thing. And so that's really what this does. And then the other part of it is that it allows other people around the world to use the museum's internet connection themselves to anonymize their location data. So if I'm in Germany, I could use like the cube at SF MoMA to disguise my location, for example.
Yeah, I mean, so maybe we could talk about this in terms of institutional critique.
Exactly. Yeah. So and so that's formally like that's the real nod to
right.
that.
There's the Hans Hacke and the guts. You're literally showing the guts of the machine here, etc. Yeah. I remember it's taken me years to understand this project, actually. And once you were trying to explain it to me, and you literally drew like I have a drawing, how the internet works, and it was like these boxes and cables. And for a second, I was like, ugh. Trevor is just mansplaining. And then I thought, I don't actually know this. Trevor is actually teaching. So there's a difference. So I like snapped to attention, like, great, tell me how the internet works. I really don't know. But I think this is a project. I want to talk to you a little bit about utopian vision, because I feel like this project and the satellite that you're going to launch partake in there is a sort of wishful what if world that you're trying to conjure or something, or at least gesture to or instantiate with some of these projects. So here is an internet that doesn't serve corporate surveillance purposes. Here also is a museum that is not about commerce. And of course, museums are not just about commerce, but that is one of the things that they do. But it is reminding us that one of the core missions of a museum is to be like a public trust and like a library. So what about then I think that is a kind of utopian dream. Do you have is that a word you have any relationship to?
No, I guess I don't have a sophisticated understanding of like the idea of utopia. I think for me, it's just more like, just because something could be like not horrible, does that mean it's utopian?
All right, fair enough. That is a low bar, right? That is like, okay, it's not going to do evil, and hence it's utopian, right? Well, but let's talk about you just arrived. The event almost didn't, we were cutting it close because you just came from a test of your satellite that's going to be launched later this summer. That is,
we got delayed.
Tell me. Oh no.
Our new launch window is September 20th to October 30th.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Well, this fall. Right. So here is a satellite that you have designed. After all these years of researching these military satellites, you've designed something that will be deployed and will be visible from for a few. Remind me of the time span.
Oh, there is an animation.
Oh, great.
It just shows how it works.
Oh, perfect. And it will have no purpose at all. It will be only an artistic gesture with no scientific merit, no military function, and no commercial possibility.
Yeah.
And that is somewhat utopian, maybe, or as you said, it is, or maybe it's just impossible. You term this a kind of impossible object. That's your rubric for this. So, maybe speak to us about the grandeur of this gesture.
It's a complicated project in that way. So this is again one of these like opposite projects. I call these the impossible objects or something like that, where you say like, okay, what's a satellite? Well, the history of spaceflight is a history of nuclear war. Like, let's not mince words. So this was imagining, what if could you build a satellite that has no military value, that has no commercial value, and that has no scientific value? And sure, you could. And so that's what this project is, and trying to imagine what would happen if you could decouple aerospace engineering from these histories and economies that it's so much, and political histories that it's so much a part of. And you can't totally do that, but you can gesture
still,
towards the idea.
It does.
Of it,
I mean, it does cost money.
Yeah, of course, it costs money, and it still goes on rockets, and it's actually piggybacking on a commercial spy satellite. I mean, these contradictions are very present.
sharply present.
No, exactly,
yeah,
absolutely. So the thing, it goes up, and then it's basically just a giant mirror that reflects sunlight down to Earth, so you can see it in the sky. And we have like a website and an app that will just say, okay, if you're in Berkeley and you say I want to see it, then you put your tell the location where you are, and then it'll say, okay, go out tonight at like 9:25 and look at this part of the sky, and these are the stars that you'll see, and this is the sculpture that's kind of there too.
How long will it be visible?
That's the topic of great debate right now. It's the orbital mechanics of it are chaotic, so you can't entirely predict it. Depends a lot on the weather of the sun, and some other stuff that's much more boring than that. But I mean, it gets really dweeby really quickly.
Give me a rough time frame.
The rough time frame is a couple months.
Okay.
So anywhere from 6 weeks to 4 months, maybe something like that. And for me, the gesture, and then it comes, then it gets sucked back to Earth and just burns up in the atmosphere. So it is a kind of, for me, on one hand, it's almost like those sand paintings that these intricately crafted things that kind of are briefly visible and then blow away on one hand, and then on the other hand, it's for me a kind of homage to the kind of like revolutionary Russian artists, really, and not only in terms of thinking about space, but also thinking about public space and thinking about like what would like some like transcendental communist, like these kind of crazy ideas that like feel like so unfamiliar at this point, that were for this very brief moment in time like taken very seriously.
Right. I mean, just to elaborate on that, like the Russian revolutionary moment, the artists were really obsessed with flight and space, and Kazimir Malevich has this wonderful quote of "Follow me, fellow aviators, swim into the abyss," and he wrote that on the occasion of making this black square, which for him was like a portal into some new dimension or something. But so what would you, I mean, how do you respond? Because I'm sure this has been a critique that has been leveled against this project, like about its kind of arrogance, about like meddling with the sky, or the waste of resource. I mean, there's probably a million different things that people could say. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think you can sharpen that. Like, there's like a lot of different critiques that one can make. I mean, is this a good use of like $1 million, or is this a?
Does it cost $1 million?
Yeah, when you add it all up. I mean,
we cannot get that from the ATM on San Pablo.
No, you can't. And there was the way I think about that is I think with that, when you hear a figure like that, you think like, oh my God, well you could like help cure a disease, or help homeless people, or whatever it is. There's obviously a huge amount of people in need in the world, but I can't take the money that I raised for the satellite and then like commit fraud. I mean, so that's a very practical aspect of it. But I think that speaks to the ways in which we've been so conditioned by a kind of these kind of incredibly precarious structures that we live with, in particular in a place like UC Berkeley, where like we can't imagine living in a society of abundance, and we of course live in an incredibly abundant society. Just that it's just so unevenly distributed. And it's perfectly reasonable for us to want to be able to live in a society in which there is justice, and there is not poverty, and there is art. These things are not at odds with each other, I guess, in the world that I think we all want to live in.
But it is still one of these impossible objects. It is still one of these objects that is meant to it's meant to lay bare how there isn't such a thing as a non-functional satellite. That space has been so colonized by military and corporate interests, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So for me, the gesture is, is in a way you're making this thing in order to point out the fact that it technically is possible to do this, but it actually is impossible in the mode of production or whatever that we find ourselves within.
I mean, maybe this is the right moment to ask this question. that I've never asked you before that I'd like to ask you, which is about gender and just about how you understand your work as, I mean, you've often talked about people like Jenny Holzer, who was your teacher, Martha Rosler. I mean, you often cite very important feminist thinkers and artists, Rosalind Deutsch, Angela Davis. This is kind of these are some of your touchstones.
Like Bordowitz, I mean, like
yeah, exactly, right. Artists, yes. So and I think that, I feel a critique of masculinity in a lot of what you do. But I guess I'm just curious how you theorize that, or if a project like this is also a kind of performance, exaggerated performance of masculinity, space. Yeah. Whoa.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I guess there's like different ways of thinking about it. I mean, like a lot of this work, there are almost like these extreme cliches of like these are the gayest stuff. Like, really like chomping through the desert and wearing cowboy boots and like being from San Francisco and this kind of stuff. Or in being in the, I guess like what I mean is that there is that kind of performance of a kind of gender on one hand, but there's another aspect of that too, which is a lot of the projects are really, in a way, take advantage of the extreme privilege that I have, kind of as like a white man. Like I can go up and photograph a military base and like not get shot.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I've always thought of your patches project, this collection of these military patches worn by actual people on these covert, weapons programs, and the fact that they just willingly give you these things, for sure, that is about like a kind of white masculinity, and also just your comfort, I think, with being an army brat, like just like how to speak that language.
Absolutely, and so I think like all of those things are kind of completely infused with these kinds of projects.
We don't, because of our unusual system here of having all of our images up, I don't know what time it is, and if we should stop and have questions.
6:30.
That means that we should. Yeah, I mean, I had all these other questions here, but I think we're gonna maybe have our time. Well, no, let me have. I mean, I'm sure somebody would ask this. Oh, by the way, I'm like, I still have so many notes, that we just didn't get to, but that's okay. One question that I had for Trevor that he so didn't want to talk about, so we're not going to talk about it, was about how his satellite might affect the astrology of the people born in the months that it was deployed. Trevor was like, what?
I don't want to be responsible for that. I hadn't thought about that.
I think that someone really, which I'm not the person who's really so into astrology that would be able to answer that, but there would be like a little asterisk, right? Like Libra with Paglen satellite or something. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about. I mean, it is pulling on the celestial forces. So the last question, and then we'll have people from the audience, which is really just about maybe give us some of your perspective on how all of this data that you've been thinking about and processing in your own work for a long time now has been so publicly weaponized, and how the revelations around Cambridge Analytica, I mean, just I guess speak to the kind of current moment and the newfound, I mean, your work is always so pressing for contemporary politics, but I think just in the last few months we have a whole different understanding of like what, how AIs can be utilized in very nefarious ways. Yeah, this is stuff we didn't even get to.
Yeah, so I think what happened was, when I was working on the Citizenfour stuff and the Snowden stuff, you're looking at these like incredibly powerful mass surveillance infrastructures that are literally beyond the wildest imaginations of anybody who was not inside NSA or inside the military. Like literally, people, there was no magic in there. Like everybody in the telecommunications industry looked at it and said like, wow, yeah, all of this stuff is like, has been technically theorized that these are attacks that you can make around the internet, but nobody imagined that somebody would actually have, the gumption to literally attack all of these things all over the world all the time, right? And so you're looking at that, and then at some point when you're looking at things like NSA, you realize like, oh, there's this other thing called Google, which is way bigger than NSA is even, and is a mass surveillance structure, and is perfectly accessible to the state in the same way that the NSA is producing product for the state, but also has other kinds of interests, which are, it is the NSA of neoliberalism or what have you, and so thinking about the ways in which there's many implications of this. Obviously, there is tremendous consolidations of power that are going on, especially when we're talking about things like artificial intelligence. Like, it requires like that scale of data to function efficiently, and so there really is like 5 or 6 like real players in the world that can do it at that scale. But of course, the other part of it is to extract money out of people, and that can happen in many different ways, like whether I'm selling a metadata profile of you to an advertiser or insurance company or credit agency or what have you. And, I think that the business model of the internet is becoming the business model of the payday lender, really, like in producing a kind of precarity and then capitalizing on that precarity to kind of extract it. I think that's really the end game of this, and or that is like the actual where the business model of the internet is going. And then there's a third layer of that, which is a little bit more philosophical and political in a different kind of sense, which has to do with self-representation. In other words, who decides what the meaning of information about you is, right? And when we look at things like AI and computer vision and like the metadata profile that's being created about somebody, what are the criteria that that go into the creation of those profiles, and what is the range of intelligibility within those systems? And I started calling this machine realism. In other words, what is the range of possible things that a algorithm can know about you and do something with? Right, and there is a kind of epistemology to that.
I think that's right, and I think, we will have questions, but this recent show at Metro, where did it go? Well,
it's right there.
Yeah, I know, but I wanted a specific one that I can't find.
Oh, which
but
one?
It's not on. It's fine. But I think that, to me, this is if you want, I want to have you speak a little, just quickly talk about how you're using these AI neural networks to what you call hallucinate these new images, and how, to me, they are very different from the kind of perfection of the drone imagery, for instance, and how they're so. In fact, when you first sent them to me, I thought of Cindy Sherman's kind of like vomit images, because they're so. I find them quite deranged, actually, and disturbing.
Yeah.
So it's it's a kind of a swerve into some other, dream world that is more nightmarish, I guess. I mean, more aesthetically nightmarish.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we can just like, you can say something about that, or we can just leave that as a.
So these are I'll describe what's going on here as quickly as I can, which is a little bit tricky. So when you're building artificial intelligence networks, you have to have things that are like training libraries, right? So you have to have data that you train the network on, right? And so a really simple thing that you want to do with AI that's very common application is be able to recognize objects, recognize people's faces, et cetera, et cetera. So we can build a very simple neural network to recognize things in your kitchen. And the first thing, if we were going to do to build this, is we'd make a list of all those things in your kitchen, like banana, pots, pans, knife, plate, fork, spoon, glass, oven, banana, whatever. So make my list, and then I need like thousands of images of each of these things, like 1,000 pictures of a fork, knife, banana, etc. And then you create your system, and then it sits there and it learns, what the difference are. It doesn't learn anything; it's just statistics. But it basically detects patterns across like what all these different objects have in common that are different than what the other objects are. And then what you can do once it's trained is you can set up a webcam and you can show it around your kitchen, and we'll say, here's a plate, there's a knife, there's a fork, there's a spoon, etc. So I started thinking about like the creation of these taxonomies is political, right? There is this moment of the political in which you decide that a certain image has a certain kind of meaning. Right? We decide that this is a fork, that this is a knife. And those are simpler examples. It gets more complicated when we're talking about like gender, like this is a woman, this is a man, which is very much a part of this. This is somebody's like emotional state, which is very quickly veers towards a kind of phrenology. But anyway, so I started building my own neural networks that and so I'm thinking about common sense and what forms of common sense are being built into autonomous systems, right? And it's usually the common sense of like engineers in Silicon Valley, right? And so I started building AIs that were based on different forms of common sense that either come from literature or history or philosophy. So I built one, for example, called the interpretation of dreams, and it's a neural network that can see and only see symbols that are significant to Freudian psychoanalysis. Right. So you said that one up, and it looks in your kitchen instead of seeing like bananas, plates, and knives and forks. It'll say like puffy faces and like injections and like windows and weird stuff. And then what I can do is once I've trained that, I can synthesize an image. So this is one from that interpretation of dreams where I say, make me a picture of a ballroom, for example, right? And then the AI draws an image of what it thinks a ballroom is. And yeah, so this is one that's trained on images from the aftermath of the first Gulf War. So it's called the aftermath of the first Smart War, and it's an AI that can only see things that were the result of this first Gulf War, which is sort of famously using the smart weapons and the military origins of a lot of these kinds of systems. So yeah, that's what's going on in these images. And I guess aesthetically, when you're making these, you're literally generating thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And for me, I guess the aesthetic language that felt compelling to me, that felt like spoke to this time, like I think about like what does now feel like, and like what now feels like to me is a combination of like the kind of intense coupling of technology and capital on one hand, and at the same time this like kind of complete decoupling of like reason from politics and so it feels like at once very technological and very surrealistic and very gothic and very violent.
They are very, I mean, we did the most what I call deranged examples aren't in here, but some of them are really disturbing, kind of melted, figural. It's very hard. I mean, we're back to a kind of indecipherability as really a form for you, which I wouldn't even call abstraction, but really almost, illegibility or something, or warping. I don't know. Some other words might come. But let's have people ask questions. I'm sure we have many. I think there's mics that are gonna go around.
About 15 minutes. Yeah.
Great, perfect.
Yeah, so I had a quick question, kind of returning back to Autonomy Cube and Orbital Reflector, about kind of how temporality functions. Like I go to the museum, I connect to Autonomy Cube for 20 minutes, and then I leave the museum. And with the same with Orbital Reflector, right? It's going to burn up in the atmosphere. It's available for like 8 weeks. And is that important? Is that inevitable? How does that space, and the fact that space is limited, function?
Yeah, I mean, so in the case of Orbital Reflector, I think it's really important that it's temporary, because it's the gesture that is important, and it is that kind of we really don't want to get into this area of making these like ridiculous. I mean, it's a monumental enough gesture as it is, so to me it's really important that it's very temporary.
That cuts down on the
it cuts down on
the monumentality.
Yeah, for me, I mean that's for me as part of that project, is that the fleetingness of it, like that making the gesture, but that the gesture actually can't hold or something like that. And so that's in relation to that. In relation to Autonomy Cube, that for me, the moment as an audience in the museum, like is just like that moment of suggesting to you that the internet could be different, right? If that comes across, like, that's great. But there's another like audience, as it were, like many other audiences for that piece, one of which is the IT department of the museum, and thinking about like what is the ethics of the communication systems that are literally in the walls of the museum, particularly at a time, and this has been like one of my little hobby horses, where museums are like kind of by sleepwalking into like building intense surveillance systems that like look at what art you're looking at, how long are you spending with it, like doing facial recognition to figure out how often people are coming in, because this is kind of stuff that marketing people want, that funders want to see data about. And I've been really going on this tear. It's like, no, you guys don't have to do this. Like this isn't natural. Like this stuff is being sold to you, but you can take a step back and think about it, and like you can say like, no, these can be places where that kind of surveillance does not go on, and that can become an active part of your mission. So that's another audience of it. The third audience for it is other people around the world. So you're really making that the bandwidth of the museum's internet connection available for people all over the world to use as well, and that we take really seriously. And so that part of the technical requirements of Autonomy Cube is that it has to have continuous power and continuous internet, so that it's not dropping in and out in terms of supporting that anonymity network that people are using.
Hi, I had a couple of comments and a question. The comments are, as I think in terms of your body of work, you do a lot of work in terms of skewing temporal and spatial relationships, and seem to enjoy that, which I do too. Also, I see a lot of the work, like the underwater fiber cables and the beaches, as kind of invisible assets. I mean, you didn't use that term, but they're kind of they're there, but they're not there. And the question I had is, when I went to the opening of your show and I looked at the deep space paintings, with the photographs rather, with the light, when I looked at them frontally, they were stark and brilliant, and like you said, very formal in terms of their composition. But when I looked at them from the periphery, like standing next to the wall, I got incredible depth cues, and I wasn't sure if that was in my head, or was the photography done in such a way that that would be possible.
That's cool. I think that I had never thought about it that way in terms of that depth, but it does make sense to me in a way formally that would happen, because they are so flat actually. But there is enough. I think you probably know better, but I would assume that combination of the kind of flatness with a lot of detail, and a lot of like not patterns, but a lot of actually things going on, that like when you would see that from different vantage points, that might become exaggerated,
like kind of like an anamorphosis effect.
Exactly. And the last thing I wanted to say is that your new piece that's going to be coming up now in September, I think of that as kind of an extension to the whole art form of earthworks.
Yeah, exactly.
Except it's sort of above earthwork. And so I think it's phenomenal.
Yeah, so it's commissioned and produced in partnership with the Nevada Museum of Art, precisely as an earthwork, and that's part of the mission of the museum.
What are the 5 places on the West Coast where the cable goes, and what gallery in San Francisco is showing your work?
The 5 major of these cable landing stations on the West Coast one is Morro Bay in Southern California. Second one is Point Arena, just north of here, by Manchester. Third one is in a place called Bandon, Oregon. And the 5th one is Seattle. No, was that 4 or was that 5? That was 4. That was 4. Yeah, that's 4. And then the gallery in San Francisco is Altman Siegel Gallery in Dogpatch on 25th in Minnesota, I think.
Hi. My question is actually for Julia. Trevor mentioned about the ethics of the museum, and I was wondering, were there any sort of ethics of the art historian that you had to navigate writing an essay about his work? Is art history sort of prepared to, kind of talk about the full range of the, I guess, connotations between democracy and policing, or, sort of drone strikes where 13-year-old Pakistani boys are afraid of blue skies? And how are contemporary art historians sort of being trained to talk about work along these lines, or how could they?
Yeah, thank you. Wow, thank you very much.
Very
Very much for your question. Appreciate it so much. Well, I'm teaching a class right now called Crowds and Clouds, where we've looked at Trevor's work. People are in the audience tonight as for extra credit, but also because, of course, they were intrinsically drawn to come to see Trevor because his work has been such a flashpoint for the class. So, I mean, I would say that I didn't feel myself like I was doing an unusual art history and writing about Trevor because he fits so well into so many art historical tropes, but I was very attentive to the fact that I wanted to situate him not just in terms of like, here's all these formal movements, that I really wanted to pay attention to the deeply political project that he's been working on, and that had to be, of course, that has to be part of any piece of writing that takes him seriously. And that for myself as a art historian who was also formed here at UC Berkeley with my own punk and DIY background, that to me, that even though we have resonated for a long time precisely because of some shared formations that have to do with being very carefully careful to situate what we do as a kind of, as a feminist project, or for me a queer project, and definitely as an anti-capitalist project. So, and I would like to think that's the kind of art history that I am fostering in my classes. I mean, my students might speak to that, but I really appreciate the question. Yeah, I mean, art history is often very deeply implicated in these systems, of course, but I think that, the more you can be aware of that and speak to it publicly, the better, as a kind of deveiling.
This is a question for Trevor and maybe Julia as well. I'm more of a feminist art historian who does visual culture, and I've been writing on masculinity and the post-heroic in artwork dealing with climate issues. And, I was, trying to think through your work through my own paradigms, and, in many ways, what you do is quite heroic. You go to these sites, you sit there forever trying to capture this sort of invisible landscape that is, deliberately concealed, and then you make it visible, but you complicate it as well. And I think, also with your project, particularly the satellite, I mean, it's hard to not take advantage in a certain sense, but it is a very monumental gesture in a certain sense, and it seems to deviate from some of your other work in a certain sense, and a fascination you obviously also have with space and technology and its militarization. But I wanted you to speak. What would be a non-monumental gesture that you could do, that that sort of without literally putting a satellite into space and things like that might get at the same critique you're working for? And do you think about these things? And do you see yourself in dialogue with other feminist artists, like, say, Connie Samaras, and a whole group of feminists who are, doing work that, connects up to yours in different ways?
Yeah, no, I mean, so for me, it is actually doing the project is really important to me. So, like, for example, I did a project called The Last Pictures, where it was on a different satellite it was on a satellite that goes into orbit around Earth and just stays there forever and sort of stays there for billions of years. And I made a work that was sort of like in parallel to the work that you were doing on the nuclear waste site markers. There was this kind of series of questions about what is an image that becomes detached from time, and like can we imagine communicating across time, or things kind of really, kind of the fact of of the materiality of these machines existing forever, kind of coupled with like what does that mean in terms of being able to communicate something, or what kind of ethical approach can one have to that. And I was actually in touch with Connie Samaras, who you mentioned too, who had done a project. She looking at that golden record that was placed on the Voyager spacecraft, and she was trying to update that and kind of have a more, more basically a different understanding of what that record might consist of. And it was a proposal, right? And it was an exhibition, and this was a show, and this is what it was. And I thought, well, why not actually do it? I think it would be a more powerful gesture if you actually did it. I mean, and it's a fucking lot more work to actually do it. No, trust me. But to me, with all of these projects, it's like, for me, I want them to be real. Like, I want to do that work to like, no, this is the place that specificity is really important to me, of like, no, it's this beach, and like it's in the frame, and this is how it is. And even if that is not, even if that work is not visible in the image, and it could be arbitrary, to me, it somehow seems important that that's there. And in the same way, like actually making the satellite, I actually think like forces those questions like in a much more real way that I don't think I would be able to get at if I was to make a proposal and then be like, here's an exhibition about my proposal for this thing that I'm not actually going to do. So in that way, and I spent a lot of time thinking about this, the monumentality of this, and that's why that temporariness of it is really important to me. And there are some side things that come out of it in the sense that we're actually proposing, one of the side benefits of it is you're proposing a system that could actually be used to mitigate against other forms of space debris, because it's like nobody designs a satellite to like actually tries to come down pretty quickly. You know what I mean? But then when you think about it, it's like actually that's like a pretty useful thing to be able to have. And so yeah, I think there is a kind of monumentality to that gesture, but I think I guess the way that I deal with that is by running towards it and trying to confront it and trying to tackle that, and kind of rather than yeah, I mean, so I don't know, to me like actually just following through with like what the implications of the gesture are seems important to me.
Maybe two more questions.
Hi, I have a quick question. Mine is sort of more about like the little bit more of like the practicality of your work. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the process of like permissions for your work. I'm assuming my first assumption was that a lot of what you do, kind of unveiling like hidden spaces, or with the satellite project, that you might come to face a lot of like roadblocks or obstacles throughout that process. And if you could just talk a bit about that.
Fundraising. Like, okay, so I don't ask permission. I mean, I mean, and I can do that because it's less likely that I'm gonna get shot doing this stuff than if I looked different, or if I had a different name or a different passport or something like that. So I think there is a huge amount of privilege that I'm afforded, that I take advantage of in terms of having, often, especially with the military kind of stuff, of having the attitude of it's better to say you're sorry than it is to ask permission and then actually not say that you're sorry. But so that's one part of it. And then with projects like the satellite project, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, space is weirdly regulated and weirdly not. I mean, so you interface with the state in two main ways. One is has to do with the radio frequencies. So how do you communicate with it? And the FCC regulates that, and so you have to get permission to use radio spectrum. And then the other kind of permission structure having to do with space flight is something called ITAR, which is everything related to spaceflight is kind of automatically considered a weapon for export purposes. And so if you want to launch a satellite like on a Russian rocket, you have to basically get an export license to export weapons. And so if you don't want to do that, then you have to do it all internally in the U.S. And that's actually what we decided to do for this orbital reflector project with the last satellite, the last pictures project that went up on a Russian rocket, but the company that we were attached on satellite to had to deal with the export stuff.
I mean, that question to me connects actually to the Earthworks question, because someone like Christo and Jean-Claude, so much of their process was about permitting and dealing with all these bureaucracies, and they actually, in some ways, they consider that the art as much as the final outcome is the incredible negotiations with all these different entities, and I think that's a really interesting way of thinking of going back to kind of landscape as performance, or how your work has a kind of performance element to it.
We didn't talk about that so much, but behind all of these projects are like really deep collaborations with a lot of people.
First of all, thank you both. It's been fascinating talk. On the satellite project, have you heard of the disco ball? There's a wealthy American guy who's launching a star. They call it the disco ball, and this is also in the next. It's coming in the next 6 months, I think. And I read about it. It was kind of appalling. This idea of this guy putting a star up as his own personal project, and the night sky is notionally public. It's not a privatized space yet. In practical matters, it might be, but it's notionally a public space. And so I felt like this guy's idea was sort of pollution, a visual pollution. And of course, it's a sort of a nirvana moment for advertisers, this idea of being able to. So I wonder how that reflects on yours. Obviously, yours is conceived differently. The motivation is different. But as a conceptual.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, so that was actually one of the big thing with this orbital reflector project was how do you try to do it in an ethical way? And really on one of the early meetings I have with the person who's the program manager, I was like, okay, we're going to need to raise this much money and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, okay, I got it. We'll raise it tomorrow. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he's like, oh, well, I'll just call Red Bull and we'll do this. And I was like, no, we're not going to call Red Bull and do this. We're going to do this the hard way, And so that, and because you're right, because it very quickly turns into an advertisement for something, or very quickly turns into a project that is, some, super predator billionaire fantasy project or something like that. And so, tried at every moment to not do that. What are all the decisions that you can make that make your life worse, but can let the project be as much as, autonomous as project, or which is obviously not possible, but there is something to that idea.
Maybe Jake, I see a hand.
Oh, okay. Hello. Hi. Huge fan of your work. Thanks for taking time. I have a question around the thing that resonates the most with me around your work is this idea of economies that are produced around information. And as an artist today, you're more or less, I wouldn't say forced, but you are put in a position of making an economy around the information that you choose to review. What's it like being an artist taking on that position today? And do you feel like you have a role in transforming the economies around and the politics around, say, academia or fine art?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so it's hard. Is the first part of the answer to I'm really lucky. Like the kind of work that I do, I never imagined that I'd be able to make a living doing this, like as recently as 10 years ago. And I still don't totally imagine that I can make a living doing it now even. So it really is tricky. I mean, you have to develop stakeholders and you have to develop funding sources and you have to start from zero every year and figure out how to raise money. And of course, you're collaborating with other people. You're collaborating with galleries and collaborating with institutions like this, or And there are ways in which you can raise the money for not only to run the studio and to, pay for your food, but then to actually do the projects themselves. And so, fortunately, that gets easier the more stuff that you do, but it also becomes more stressful because you are responsible for more stuff, and you have more. The consequences of screwing up become greater and greater. On one hand, and then to the second part of your question, in terms of like changing those economies of academia and changing the economy of, art itself, I have never made it my goal to like change the economy of like how the art world works. There's people that work on that, love them, really happy they do. I am a person that has limited range of what I can take on, and that's not something that I'm going to take on just because I don't have the energy for it, or not, honestly, actually, really the interest. And so that's on one hand, and then the academia stuff. It's interesting. I mean, I don't. It is I feel like I have a really weird position in relation to academia, because I feel very at home in academia on one hand, and then very like not at home at the same time, in the sense that I did come out of an academic department, but I also really don't care about a lot of the specificities of it, or I think that, yeah, I mean, I really care and really don't care at the same time. So I don't know what I mean other than that. I guess what I mean by that is like what always frustrated me about academia was the forms, right? The idea of the peer-reviewed paper in the fucking journal published by Wiley that owns your copyright. I'm like, what the fuck is this? As like a form, you know what I mean? And like, what is the politics of this? And that always drove me crazy. And like the idea that academia did not feel responsible to a greater public in a lot of cases, like academics, like that really always also really bothered me. I was just like, anybody.
But who were you? I mean, I don't know. That seems like a very monolithic statement.
No, that's way too monolithic. Yeah. No, absolutely. But the fact that like within one's career as an academic, you wouldn't get credit for doing public service actually for the public.
Yes,
really?
You would. Yes.
Okay, well that's not the way
I think, and thanks to Shannon Jackson in part in her advocacy, it's like there's
a
box
fantastic.
on the form. Yeah, academia is. Actually get credit for public doing public service.
That's fantastic. That's great.
I want to say thank you to Trevor and to all of you, and invite you to have him sign your book outside, which will be for sale. So that's
perfect.
In other words,
thank you guys for coming.
Yeah.